with Lindsey German and Kate Connelly. Just to say that this talk is being live streamed, so if you want to share
Sorry, I can't hear you, sorry. I don't know if I'm deaf or...
This talk is being live streamed, so if you want to share it and tweet it, that would be great. So first we'll hear from Kate Connelly, and then afterwards Lindsey German. Hey.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for coming. I want to start off by talking about Marx and Engels, and I think one of the sort of important places to start here in terms of the way in which Marx and Engels analysed society was they were very much concerned with how society was organised at its most basic level, first and foremost, as a basis for understanding all of the other things which I'm going to come on to. And particularly when I talk about understanding society at that most basic level, they were concerned with how we produce and reproduce our own existence. And this was an approach to history that was very much against the kind of dominant sort of philosophies at the time, often sort of very idealistic philosophies which kind of defined different ages of philosophy, and which were very much to do with the kind of internal, inner intellectual journeys of these sort of individual philosophers who declared certain ages to represent certain things without looking at the most kind of basic and fundamental organisation of society. So, writing in a book that they didn't publish in their own lifetime, but were really a kind of collection of their thoughts about history and how they were going to approach any kind of understanding of society, a piece later called The German Ideology. They said this about the way in which they thought it was important to analyse the way that history develops and the way that society is developed. And they said about their own approach, this conception of history depends on our ability to expound the real processes of production, starting out from the material production of life itself, and to comprehend the form of intercourse connected with this and created by this mode of production, i.e. civil society in its various stages, as the basis of all history. And then he said they're going to trace from that, the various religions and philosophies and ethics that those societies hold, and trace their origins and growth from that basis, by which means, of course, the whole thing can be depicted in its totality. And by that understanding, by attempting to approach a kind of total understanding of society, they were also attempting to understand how to change that society in its totality. Marx obviously famously said, philosophers have only interpreted the world, the point, however, is to change it. So that was the motive here. And then in later works, particularly Engels' book on the origin of the family, society and private property, which was a book that he wrote out of the notes that Karl Marx had taken. Marx had become very interested in the history of the family. They stated explicitly that this production also included the production of immediate life, and that this production that they were looking at, this is from Engels' book, it's written after Marx died. This is what Engels said. He said, this production of society is of a twofold character. On the one side, the production of the means of existence, of articles of food and clothing, dwellings, and of the tools necessary for that production. On the other side, the production of human beings themselves, the propagation of the species. The social organisation under which the people of a particular historical epoch and a particular country live is determined by both kinds of production, by the stage of development of labour on the one hand and of the family on the other. And so this exploration, and by analysing these sort of the way in which these two things work, what he meant by this sort of propagation of human beings, including the bringing up of the children, the caring for the sick, all of the things that were done within the family, what we would call social reproduction, has under capitalism typically and generally and mostly been assigned to women. And under capitalism, they very much were interested in analysing the kind of interrelationship between this twofold nature of production. And indeed, for capitalists, the propagation of human beings, the reproduction of human life, was important for them in terms of their reproduction of their profits. So for capitalists, these things are inherently linked. And so within the system in which we live, social reproduction is subordinated to and shaped by the needs of capitalism. So how do we know this? How can we kind of understand this? And again, I think it's important to look at the works of Friedrich Engels. And I think this shows, I'm going to sort of talk about what he wrote in a book, one of his very, very early books, The Condition of the Working Class in England. And I think this shows to what extent this was a really long-standing concern of Engels. I've just talked about a book that he published right towards the end of his life. But I think when we think about Marx and Engels writing about capitalism, I think it's important to say these were issues and concerns that run all the way through their writings. It wasn't just something they sort of decided to look at sort of at the end. And in this book, Engels wrote it because he was a young man who'd come to Manchester, ostensibly to work in his sort of one of the managers of his father's cotton mill. But in fact, he was also kind of being sent away from Germany to get away from revolutionary ideas. In fact, he was sent to one of the most concentrated areas of the Industrial Revolution and the development of the Industrial Revolution, and started to write revolutionary anti-capitalist books on the basis of what he was seeing and experiencing. And particularly up in the northwest of the country, this is where the kind of development of the mills and the factories was at its most intense. And Engels writes about really the way in which the drive for profit in this kind of early stage of capitalism and capitalist development was so rapacious and so intense that it was leading to almost the complete destruction and annihilation of the working class family. That because everybody within the working class was expected to work so hard, the children, women, men were all expected to work in the factory in enormous, ridiculous days of work that was really kind of killing people. He explores the way in which this destroyed human relationships. But also there's a really interesting passage where he quotes a letter written about the way in which he sort of is exploring the way in which for a particular period, when there was kind of economic recession hitting, that a number of the factory owners decided that because women and children could be paid a lot less, they would actually restrict their employment largely to women, and this threw a lot of men out of work. And he quotes this letter from a man who's gone to see his friend, a male friend, and this male friend is out of work. His wife is working in the factory pretty much all hours of the day, not being much of an exaggeration. And her husband is unemployed and is at home and is darning her stockings and is doing all of the domestic labour in the house. And this letter talks about how this man feels and about how sort of miserable his whole existence is, but also how he sort of in some ways feels quite emasculated and totally miserable about that as well, and not just the situation in which they're in. And then Engels concludes this, I think, with a very kind of interesting point. So he describes this and then he says, either we can just despair about the way in which sometimes society is turned upside down and people are sort of reduced to a feeling of experience of despair. He said, or we must admit that human society has hitherto sought salvation in a false direction. We must admit that so total a reversal of the position of the sexes can have come to pass only because the sexes have been placed in a false position from the beginning. If the reign of the wife over the husband, as inevitably brought about by the factory system, is inhuman, the pristine rule of the husband over the wife must have been inhuman too. And I think what he's saying here is that this is inhuman, and that the use of that word is so important. It's inhuman because it's organised around inhuman needs. The needs of capital, the needs for a few to profit in this system from the labour of everybody else. And he's saying that what's happened to the family and the way in which that's organised is being organised around the needs of capital and a few capitalists. And he writes really about the kind of the way in which this rapid industrialisation is really destroying working class families. He talks about the very high rates of death. He also talks about the way in which the very nature of factory work is kind of, having to stand at a cotton mill and working there was literally deforming people, the way in which this produced terrible complications around childbirth, the way in which there was nobody at home to look after children at all, so there was very, very high infant mortality. All of these kinds of things. He talks about this very high level of neglect. And I think there is something very revolutionary about, not just what he's saying, but the way in which he's saying this, exploring of working class life and women's experience. This is a man who's supposed to be doing this bourgeois job, who's come from Germany, a sort of 19th century German gentleman, talking about the way in which the factory system is just disrupting women's bodies. He talks about menstruation, all of these kinds of things. So we can see that this was, even the way in which capitalism was developing was really threatening to undermine the future profits of capitalism itself. If it couldn't even guarantee the lives of the next generation of workers, this actually became quite troubling even to capitalists who didn't care about the experiences of their workers or the pain their workers were experiencing. And so they instituted legal changes to this. And so we see in the 19th century the Factory Acts being passed, a whole series of legislation which restricts the amount of work that women can do. Around the time that Engels is writing in 1844, women are restricted to a 12-hour day. But you can see the way in which legally there's this sort of restriction on the amount that women can work in order that they can then be engaged in this work of social reproduction, which the capitalists obviously very much needed in order to ensure future profits beyond just one generation of workers. And therefore, I think it's important to note there have been very, very great changes in the family. And however important, and I don't want to underestimate this, some of these things have been incredibly important for women and women's sense of themselves and our capacity to change things, and have been indeed produced by women organising and agitating. I think it's also important, on the other hand, to say that this hasn't produced what we would understand to be liberation in any sense at all. And I think that is because it is still organised around those inhuman needs. And so, work, if we think about just think about the 20th century and the way in which the nature of women's work has changed so fundamentally in many different ways. You can see, many sort of individual women will have experienced huge changes just over their lifetime in terms of what they're expected to do and what their family role is and what their working role is. If you think about sort of beginning of the 20th century when huge numbers of women worked in domestic service, when there was an expectation, which was very largely unfulfilled, that women would give up work on marriage. When the women were having very many more children, when at the beginning of the 20th century the idea of having a child outside of marriage was something that was treated as incredibly shameful, in the sort of dominant ideas of society. Now we know that the fastest growing form of the family, not the largest but the fastest growing form, is of cohabiting couples with children rather than married couples. If you think about the way in which the world wars propelled huge numbers of women into factories and into industrial work, in the Second World War, the creation of creches inside of workplaces in order that there could be childcare provided for them as well, which then gets ripped away in the 1950s by the end of the war, because the needs of capital have changed. Therefore, the form of the family and the effect on the family is going to change fundamentally. And then that pressure for women to very much be in the home, against something that didn't really happen for very many women, but was a kind of social expectation that becomes reinforced. And we can see that now women are having fewer children, and we can also see the effects of economics upon the kind of structures of our families. I mean, for example, the Office of National Statistics says that, looking over statistics from last year, And it looks at the number of young people who live at home with their parents, young people, very flatteringly, including those from the age of 20 to 34. And that's a figure that's increased from 21% in 1996 up to 25%. And whereas I'm sure that we can't just attribute that to a huge growth in kind of filial affection, we all know why that's happened. We all know why that change within the family has happened. It's because of economics, and it's because of young people not being able to get work with enough pay in order to move out and find anywhere at all to live. And so despite these huge changes, I think it's very, very evident that oppression still remains. I mean, if we think about things like the pay gap, which the Fawcett Society sort of recently produced a report saying that at current levels of change, the pay gap might be closed in 100 years. So that's kind of no good to anyone here. The pay gap is worse for older women because it gets worse over women's lifetime, but it's also worsening for younger women, which is, I think, to do with the growth of temporary and insecure work, and the rapid creation of a very low-wage economy in Britain. And of course, we can see how this intersects with other oppressions in society. The pay gap is worse for black and ethnic minority women. Women are almost twice as likely to be in low-paid jobs or in the lowest-paid jobs than men. And when we look at what those jobs are and what those jobs constitute, very often service jobs, waiting, catering, caring jobs, cleaning, nursing, these jobs are connected with social reproduction, are many of the tasks of social reproduction, and are therefore valued less because women very often do those jobs for free within the home. So we can see the way in which this is having